So let's look at rearranging our formulas. So when we calculate our average speed, we've seen that your speed is equal to change in distance over change in time. So whenever you're doing your calculations, you should get used to, because this goes all the way through high school and university as well, you'll always receive a mark, change in distance over change in time. You'll always receive a mark for writing your formula. So get used to doing that now and putting that formula down. Even though a lot of times you're just sitting doing that work on your own, you may as well get used to doing it properly. Okay, so the easiest is when we're solving this equation is when we ask you for speed. But you'll see in some of these questions, I'll be asking you for distance, and some of them you'll be asked for time. Now, when you're writing the formula, you don't technically have to put the delta, which means change in distance, and you don't technically have to put the delta, which is change in time. This is just to say that if you were given two distances, so let's say you started at the 10-meter mark and you had to drive 1,000 kilometers. Well, then technically you didn't drive 1,000, you drove 990. So that's why the delta is there. So if you've got two distances, you subtract them. If you've got two times, you subtract them. So the easiest, again, is if you're solving for v is equal to d over t. But what if we're asking you for d? So here's where it comes down to math. In order to get that d all by itself, you need to think of the opposite of what it's attached to. So here we've got three variables, v, d, and t. I need to get the variable d by itself, but it's not as simple as just taking that t and moving it over. Right now, d is over t. What does it mean when d is over t? Mathematically, that is dividing. So we're going to do the opposite of that to get rid of that t. Well, if we're dividing, the opposite of dividing is multiplying. So I'm going to multiply this side by t. Okay, so now if we multiply this side by t, well, now look here, you've got a t on the top and a t on the bottom. So what's going to end up happening is those t's are going to cancel out. But in math, you can't just multiply one side when you've got an equal sign by t. You've got to also multiply the other side. So now I'm left with distance on one side of my equation and time and speed on the other side. Now, whether you put a times between them or whether you leave it as this, they mean to actually multiply. And there's your formula. Now, I personally, when I'm solving, I like to solve to the right of my page. So a lot of times I'll rewrite it and go d is equal to t times v. So either way you have it, it's exactly the same. Okay, so now let's look at time. What if we're given, so we started again, let's start with that original formula. Speed is equal to distance over time. Okay, so now I need to get time all by itself. Okay, so as I said before, you're going to do the opposite of what it's attached to. But here's the tricky thing. So a lot of times people are going to end up moving this t over to the other side right away. But if you do that, you're actually moving the inverse of it because the t is not on the top. So what you have to do is if you end up having a formula and the variable that you need ends up being the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction, your very first step is actually going to cross multiply. Okay, so cross multiplying means, now remember, any whole number, in this case here, whole letter, is the same as writing it over 1. And if I cross multiply, I'm going to multiply v and t. And I'm going to put that on one side of the equal sign. And then 1 times d, which is just d. There we go. Now I can start moving things around. Okay, so now I need to get t by itself. Okay, so now right now t is still attached to v by multiplying. The opposite of multiplying is dividing. So I'm going to divide by v to get rid of that v. Ta-da, it's gone. But in math, if you do it to one side, you have to also do it to the other side. So now I have t is equal to d over v. Now let's go back to that original one here and let's see what would have happened had we forgotten to cross multiply. So if we had that v is equal to d over t, a common mistake is students will say, okay, I need to get this t all by itself. Well, it's being attached to this by dividing. So I'm going to divide by d, so those cancel out. Divide by d. And then what they think they have is V over D is equal to T. But what you actually have is when you divide D by D, you get 1. So you actually have the inverse. So a lot of people rearrange this incorrectly, and that ends up being wrong. Now, if you find that you really struggle with these formulas and converting them is difficult, at the grade 10 level, you can actually get by. When you get to the 20 level, you'll really struggle. So I do recommend working through these and rearranging these formulas so that it ends up getting easier. But it might mean that you might have to multiply 3 variations of every formula. And we're going to be looking at quite a few. So you'll know standard that you've got speed is equal to distance over time. And if you don't understand how to actually manipulate it, then you're going to have to also memorize that D is equal to V times T, and that T is equal to D over V. So no matter which variable we ask you for, you've got all 3 versions here. And then don't forget as well, for any type of assessment that you have access to your data sheet. And this very first formula that we've looked at, and all the formulas we're going to be using for physics, can all be found on this first page of your data sheet. So there's that formula here. So I find some students will actually take the variants and they'll put them up here as well so that they've got access to all of those formulas. Okay, now I hope that helped. Remember, you can always message your teacher to set up a G Meet or to come in person to help explain this concept further.